This is video 5.5, Listening in Discipleship, What It Is and What It Is Not. If you remember in Module 3, we presented listening as one of the two vital pieces of discipleship. And we deliberately wanted to place that heavy emphasis on listening without moving on immediately to how you respond, in order to really give that emphasis some time to settle. Because I think though most of us are aware that listening does play an important role in discipleship, we're usually really quick to cut short that step and get right to the part that where we get to respond. So now we're going to come back to listening to give some direction for where that listening can lead. But I just want to remind you that it is vital not to shortchange the listening in order to skip to this step. So now to answer that question some of you may have had earlier when we were first talking about listening. Yes, you do have an active role to play as a listener. A great way to understand this role is to think of a counselor or a psychologist. You know that image we all have in our minds of what that therapy session looks like, where the client's laying down, relaxed on this gorgeous couch, and they're spilling their guts to someone who's writing everything down. A counselor is a listener, but their role doesn't begin and end with listening. They're a listener in order to be a guide and helper. A counselor comes to the conversation with extensive knowledge and training. They're trained how to ask good questions, how to process the information in the stories that they're hearing. A good counselor doesn't just give their clients the answers to their life's problems, even if they think that they know the answer or the solution. A good counselor guides their client to process their own experiences in order to begin drawing conclusions and reaching answers for themselves. This is how you can model your role as a discipler. Like a counselor, you're coming to this relationship with knowledge and with training. You have knowledge of God and of Scripture and the church. You have training in ministry, experience with service, and processing your own questions of faith and probably other people's questions of faith. And like a counselor, your role isn't to just then share all that information, but to actively listen, ask questions and follow-up questions, and use your training to process what you hear in order to offer small bits of direction and guidance to help them begin answering their faith questions for themselves. Faith is not something that can be given. But if you can direct someone on their journey so that they begin to draw their own conclusions and answer questions for themselves, you will be setting them up not only to flourish in their own walk with God, but also to help them become disciplers. Now let's switch and start talking about what listening is not. Listening is not enabling or reinforcing. It can be easy to accidentally reinforce negative thoughts or tendencies in an effort to be empathetic. And it can also be hard to know the line between listening to someone processing some negative church experiences and simply having a trash talking session. One of the ways that I have found to help me be an active listener without giving someone free rein to reinforce any negative ideas is providing some kind of anchor. I've looked at the Psalms as an example of that anchor for my own spiritual walk. There are so many deep and serious questions of faith in the Psalms and even accusations. In Psalm 13, David says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart?" And the psalm continues with more and more questioning. But then, as it draws to a close, David says, "But I trust in your unfailing love." Questions are good, and they're normal, and they're vital to growing faith. But if you give free rein to dwell in the questions, then you can get stuck in this downward spiral. All throughout the Psalms, when you see these questions, they always end with some kind of statement of truth. Here's all my questions. These are my doubts. I don't understand this. But here's one thing that I do know. And that just one tiny statement of truth, no matter how small, acts as the anchor to keep me from that downward spiral. And that's what we can provide for others. One example that happened recently, some of our friends who were part of Missio for a couple years had begun pulling away during the pandemic, and we tried to reach out as much as we could, but eventually they became pretty unresponsive. But a couple of months ago, the husband of uh, this couple contacted Jared and asked to get together. And during that meeting, he shared what we had expected. They had been wrestling with some things that they were seeing in Christianity at large, and they struggled to reconciling that with what they believed about God. And since they had pulled away from community during that time of questioning, they were left in that downward spiral of questions until that meeting. He told Jared that they considered themselves to be agnostics. Jared responded by listening and reaffirming the relationship, but also by providing an anchor. Jared shared that he and I had actually wrestled with a lot of the same questions during that time, but we had ended up with different conclusions than they had. He didn't say, "Oh, so you were wrong. These are what the right answers actually are." He simply said, I'm accepting and affirming of you and your journey and where it has led you, and it's not going to change our relationship, but I hope that you will then do the same for me and acknowledge that I've wrestled with a lot of the same questions and I've come to different conclusions. So when you and I connect, I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm speaking from this place of different conclusions than the ones that you've reached. And that meeting ended with an incredible relief on the part of our friend. First, that he wasn't looked down upon or disowned for their journey. He actually shared that his biggest concern was that if they shared their doubts and their questions, that they would lose their community. The irony of that is, of course, that they withdrew from their community so they wouldn't have to face that fear, and ended with the same result. But there was also relief in hearing that there's a possibility to reach different conclusions to their questions. They didn't want to lose their faith, but they just hadn't been able to come to conclusions to their questions that allowed them to keep their faith. But Jared's anchor gave our friend hope that it is a possibility to have those questions and maybe come to different conclusions that can allow you to keep your faith and can actually reinforce that faith. Our friends aren't there yet. I don't know what the rest of their journey will look like, and I don't know how much of a role we will play in it. But our prayer is that that small anchor that Jared was able to give during a conversation in which he mostly listened will be something that our friends can hold on to.